Imagine that you're walking down one of the canal streets in Amsterdam, and as you turn your head to take in the beauty of the water, you see a child struggling to swim, and it becomes apparent that they are drowning. You desperately want to help the child, and because you know you can swim very well and that the water is calm, you rush into the water and save the child, taking them to safety. When passers-by thank you and congratulate you on your successful rescue attempt, you reply to them that it was no problem at all, because it was merely your moral duty to do so. In this case, your reason for helping the child was because you thought it was your moral duty. You had an idea of some moral principle or rule that you should follow, so that if anyone else were in a similar situation, they would do the same thing. But now imagine that the person drowning in the river was not just that child who you didn't know previously, but in fact a loved one of yours, perhaps your own child or wife or husband. When you give the reason for why you jumped in to save your loved one, it might seem a bit strange if you stated that it was merely your moral duty to do so. When we help our loved ones out, we do not merely do so because we are following a general moral rule or principle, but because we care for that particular person, and because we take interest in that person's safety and well-being. For example, I jump in to save my wife from drowning because she is my wife, and in that moment, I care specifically for her. As this example shows, there is a difference between two contrasting ways to determine and justify what the right thing is to do. On the one hand, we could appeal to general and universal moral principles, such as the consequentialist principle that we ought to produce the best consequences for the most number of people, or Kant's moral principle that we ought to act in accordance with what he calls the categorical imperative. As a consequentialist, our justification for saving our loved one from drowning would be that it produced the best consequences for the most people, and as a Kantian, our justification would be that if we didn't do so, then it would violate the categorical imperative. There are three important aspects to bear in mind when we rely on moral principles in this way. First of all, these moral principles are general and universal, because they are applicable for everyone and in all cases. In other words, the principle is not only relevant to me when deciding whether to save someone from drowning in this instance, but it is relevant in all circumstances and for all people. Secondly, these moral principles are impartial, because they do not allow us to give anyone in particular special treatment, which means that we cannot pick anyone out as being more worthy of our help and concern. So our reason for saving our loved one from drowning would not be that they are our loved one, but that it was the right thing to do, according to the moral principle. And finally, these moral principles are rational, which means that we use our reason to determine what the right thing is to do. When we are deciding whether to save the child from drowning, we do not use our feelings or emotions to guide us, but we use our thoughts to figure out or rationalize what the moral principle would tell us to do. However, some moral philosophers find appealing to these general, impartial, and rational principles to be problematic. For example, Bernard Williams claims that someone who has to appeal to a moral principle when deciding whether to save their loved one from drowning has what he calls one thought too many. We shouldn't have to consult a moral principle and think about it, but we should be driven by a feeling of concern particularly for our loved one. Our moral decision-making should not be mediated by an extra thought about what a general moral principle tells us to do. Feminist thinkers have also critiqued impartial and rational moral theories as being stereotypically male-oriented. In order to be rational and impartial, these theories emphasize what are often considered to be the male traits of doing our duty, being bound by obligations, and overcoming or neglecting our emotions and feelings so that we can do the right thing. This is in sharp contrast with the stereotypical female traits of relying on emotions and feelings of care and love towards others. For example, in an empirical study of the difference between male and female moral outlooks, Carol Gilligan found that male participants showed a propensity to be concerned with following rules and principles of justice, whilst the female participants placed more emphasis on preserving relationships and caring for those that they love. Such a study could be critiqued as perpetuating problematic stereotypes about so-called female and male traits. To begin with, we might worry about making a sharp binary distinction between female and male genders in the first place. And we might also worry about attaching essential attitudes and traits to a particular gender, inaccurately claiming that females cannot be rational or interested in principles of justice, or that males are not concerned with preserving relationships and caring for their loved ones. This seems to rely on problematic and outdated stereotypes. Irrespective of these worries, in the late 20th century, what emerged from the critique of rational and impartial reliance on moral principles was a new approach called care ethics, put forward by philosophers such as Annette Beyer, Virginia Held, Nell Noddings, and Michael Sloat. There are three main commitments of care ethics. First of all, figuring out the right thing to do is not determined rationally, but instead we ought to focus on developing attitudes and sentiments of care, empathy, and compassion towards others, which will inform our actions and choices. For example, our moral reason for saving the child from drowning is not that we had to do it because it was a duty, but because we wanted to, out of compassion and care for that child. Second, what counts as the right thing to do should not be determined impartially or abstractly, but instead by the nature of our particular relationships and connection to others. This means that rather than considering the drowning child as just another random person we have to save, we consider that particular child as important to us in that moment. This also makes sense of why it sounds strange to refer to a general moral rule when explaining why you saved your loved one. It is the special concern that you have towards your loved one that guides your moral actions and choices. And finally, the right thing to do is not determined by relying on general or universal rules that apply to everyone and in every circumstance. Rather, moral decisions and actions are always dependent on each particular situation and relative to the particular people involved in them. This is actually quite demanding of us as moral actors, as it means we cannot rely on preordained and already determined rules to guide our actions. Instead, we have to take each situation as particular, requiring individual attention and consideration. Of course, there are criticisms of the theory of care ethics. Some claim that morality just ought to be about impartial principles that guide our actions in general and universal situations. This means that the sentiments of care and need for relationships is not really a moral issue at all, but a personal one. It has also been argued that morality is not about the competing values of impartiality and rationality on the one hand, and partiality and feelings on the other, but a balance or mix of both. This means that care ethics would only pick out one side of a cohesive understanding of morality. And others have claimed that care ethics is limited. In globalized and large communities, it is impossible to create feelings of connection and care with everyone we have a moral responsibility to. Despite these objections, the development of care ethics has been influential in guiding our contemporary approaches as to how we should organize society. The theory has been applied to social debates about, for example, animal rights, reproductive technology, climate change, capital punishment, medical ethics, and leadership. And more recently, care ethics is considered not just to be a theory, but an active movement and call for social change.